it's not much of a surprise to learn that the Russians are treating Ukrainian prisoners of war with utter brutality, but the details uncovered this morning by the Times' war correspondent Anthony Loyd are still hugely shocking. If you subscribe to the Times, you should read his piece this morning. It really is an incredible piece of journalism. And I'm delighted to say we can talk to Anthony from Ukraine now. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning.
Tell us about, you've been speaking to one soldier in particular who's been released. He was at Mariupol, he was captured, and he was part of the big prisoner exchange a few days ago. You've been speaking to him. What's he been telling you?
So this is a Ukrainian Marine Lieutenant Serhiy Strachuk. He was captured in Mariupol towards the end of April and was released 10 days ago as part of the largest prisoner exchange since the Russian invasion, involving about 300 people, of whom about 250 were Ukrainians. He spoke to me from a rehabilitation center where he's being psychologically and physically reevaluated and healed from his experience. And he detailed the system of prisons through which he was put through, both in Russian-held areas of Ukraine and in Russia itself. And he talked about this regime of, as much as the torture and abuse he described, there was a kind of terrible, listless suffocation to the whole experience. You're held in a fairly small cell with other prisoners. You're forbidden from talking. The day starts when you have to sing the Russian national anthem at 6 a.m. You're often not allowed to sit down, so the prisoners for 16-hour stretches of time have to kind of walk around their small cell, not allowed to speak. There's no pens, there's no paper, you can't read, you can't write. There's no contact with any humanitarian organizations, no access to the ICRC or the UN. And you're beaten with batons or electric cattle prods for anything, for talking, particularly if you dare talk in Ukrainian, and often just beaten for the sake of it in order to kind of subjugate you. And those beatings went on right until the moment they were handed over across the Ukrainian border as part of the release. He described being on a plane with 215 Ukrainian prisoners, all of them bound, all of them blindfolded, and electrocuted with cattle probes right up until the moment of their release.
And how shocked are you about this, Anthony? I mean, I know that Russia doesn't operate in a rules-based system, but are these not what amount to war crimes being perpetrated in plain sight?
Well, the UN has already referred in a report 5 days ago to the treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian prisons as likely being war crimes. I'm not surprised by it at all. I mean, the whole Russian narrative has been that Ukrainian soldiers are not part of an army, they're part of a criminal organization. So with that mentality in mind, it's not surprising that they would be treated as criminals within the Russian prison system, with all that that entails. Also, there is a brutality in the psychology of Russians towards Ukrainians, particularly towards Ukrainian fighters anyway. So I'm not surprised, but Strachuk's account is a pretty detailed account, one of the first really detailed accounts of what the prison systems involved. He was moved from one prison to another prison, finally ending up in Bryansk in Russia, where all this occurred.
And does the stories like this, the tales of this emerging, does it stiffen the resolve? Maybe the Ukrainian resolve doesn't need stiffening, but it does illustrate the points for which they're fighting.
Well, it illustrates the points to which for which they're fighting. It illustrates very well Russia's mentality towards Ukrainian competence, but it also places very firmly in the minds of Ukrainian soldiers what choices they have if they are surrounded, whether they should let themselves be taken prisoner or try to escape or fight on until the end. Strachuk's account of the fighting in Mariupol, he was actually a platoon commander of 2 Brits as well. That is in itself pretty horrific, what they went through during that battle. But he said in the rehabilitation center where he is now that most of the trauma came about not from the battle in Mariupol, but from the treatment in Russian prisons afterwards.
And what's your view of where we are in the war then now, Anthony? That it's felt like that there has been this progress, continued progress, since a lot of the Western weapons arrived, the major sort of new weapons arrived, and it feels like there's been this pushing of Russia back towards its own border. But then, of course, there's been the fake referendums that happened a week ago. What's your judgment of where we all are now?
Well, we're in a pretty uneasy place. On the one hand, there has been a strategic shift of initiative from the Russians to the Ukrainians. You can see that in the ongoing offensives yesterday. Liman was taken, which was a key logistics hub and communications route taken by the Ukrainians from the Russians. You got reports of the Ukrainians making a breakthrough northeast of Kherson last night and this morning. So in that way, there has been a strategic shift. However, by the same token, you see, despite Russian confusion and setback, an escalation on their behalf as well. You've got lots of threats of tactical nuclear weapons being used. You've had the referendum to seize and secure land Russia has already taken from Ukraine, and mobilization. The war is in a very precarious stage of chaos and escalation.
One page of the Times, just briefly, Anthony, says Putin's threat to go nuclear may not be a bluff. This is according to a senior US figure. How much does tactical nuclear strikes get mentioned where you are, Anthony? How much is it seen as even a possibility?
Well, it's certainly seen as a possibility. And also, I think it was notable before coming here in the West, people talk about it, tactical nuclear strikes in a fairly theoretical way. But here, when you have that conversation, it leads immediately to pretty serious worry amongst anybody you're having a conversation with actually in Ukraine. It is a concern. Overall, they hope that the West remains strident and resolved in its support of Ukraine, and that it is a bluff that can be called out, but it's a pretty dangerous bluff.
Exactly right. Anthony, great to speak to us ever. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
That's Anthony Loyd there, the Times of War correspondent.
Apologies.